If you look at global politics right now, there's this complete decoupling. The public face is all about peace talks, massive financial aid. But the reality on the ground, it's escalating violence and, frankly, systemic rule breaking. You see Brussels agreeing to a 90 billion euro lifeline for Ukraine, and at the exact same time, Russian forces are running what are essentially medieval-style civilian abduction operations right across the Sumy border. This is Neuropulse. Let's analyze. Okay, let's start right there with that monumental contradiction in Eastern Europe. The facts on the ground, they're chilling. In Ukraine's Sumy Oblast, near the border village of Herbovsky, Russian troops crossed and forcibly removed about 50 civilians. And these weren't soldiers, not military targets. The majority were elderly. One reported victim was 89 years old.
And that operation, it signals a really profound strategic shift. This isn't just about grabbing a small piece of territory anymore. This is the execution of a policy that you can only really describe it as survival space erasure.
Survival space erasure. That's a powerful term. What do you mean by that exactly?
It means making the land permanently unlivable for civilians. And because of that, permanently unusable for the Ukrainian state. By removing the elderly, the non-combatants, through just sheer terror, Moscow is trying to empty that critical border strip. They get a security buffer zone, but without the cost, without the manpower you'd need for a formal occupation.
Yeah.
They're weaponizing fear to create a kind of invisible demographic wall.
Right. And what's so jarring is the timing. As you said, at the exact same time these reports are coming out, the EU in Brussels agrees to this massive 90 billion euro package for Ukraine. So tell us about the money, the mechanism there.
The mechanism is critical because it tells you everything about the political appetite in Europe right now. It's structured as a reparations loan. It's not a direct seizure of frozen Russian central bank assets. The funds are borrowed against the future interest and, the hope for eventual return of those assets.
So why the convoluted structure? Why not just seize the assets outright and give the funds directly?
It's a retreat from what they see as a dangerous precedent. The political thinking is all about avoiding these huge property rights challenges. I mean, if you unilaterally seize another country's central bank reserves, even an aggressor's, it spooks a lot of neutral states. It tells them their own sovereign wealth might be vulnerable down the line.
It's a compromise.
It's a compromise. Macro financial support, yes, but one that avoids shaking the legal pillars of the whole global financial system.
Okay, so let's connect that financial compromise back to the brutal reality on the ground in Sumy. What's the critical implication?
The implication is a fatal time lag. That huge financial package is Ukraine's life support, absolutely. But Moscow's coldly exploiting the gap. They know that 90 billion euros cannot instantly become physical force on the ground to protect, an isolated village. The money is massive, but the terror is immediate. Their whole strategy depends on that time deficit.
That compromise, that global retreat from strong economic action, it's not just about Russia, is it? It sends a signal. And that brings us directly to a kinetic challenge to the global economic backbone, this time in the Caribbean. Right, let's turn to Venezuela. The U.S. has enforced what President Trump called a total and complete blockade. And the enforcement arm, the U.S. Coast Guard and Navy, just seized a second oil tanker. It's reported as the Panama Flag Centuries, right there in the Caribbean. This is a very deliberate, physical move to choke off Venezuela's oil exports, which are still running at around, 590,000 barrels a day?
And it's a classical, almost 19th century naval power play, but it's aimed at a very 21st century problem. The goal here is twofold. Physically stop the oil, of course, but also to target the alternative financial infrastructure that makes it all possible.
The market reaction confirmed that immediately. Brent crude it spiked vertically, a clear signal of supply risk. But the digital reaction was maybe even more pointed. Bitcoin had been trending up, but after the blockade announcement, you saw this sharp, immediate drop of several hundred points.
Right. And that Bitcoin drop is where the real strategic meaning is. The U.S. is defending dollar hegemony not just on the seas, but in the digital realm.
So if the oil is being moved by a shadow fleet, how exposed is that shadow financial system to a naval blockade? Isn't there a disconnect between the physical ships and the digital wallets?
That's the core vulnerability they're targeting. The physical blockade immediately makes the market fear and escalation to what we're starting to call an on-chain blockade.
On-chain blockade.
It means the U.S. Treasury will ramp up action, maybe even attempt to seize crypto wallets and exchanges tied to sanctioned states like Venezuela. You have to remember, Venezuela relies heavily on USDT stablecoins as its main alternative to the dollar for trade. So if the U.S. can show that it can choke off those digital arteries, Even when the transaction is supposed to be censorship resistant, it fundamentally challenges the core promise of crypto. It shows that dollar hegemony isn't just physical, it's digital.
This aggressive defense of the dollar, it's forcing adversaries to look for real structural hedges, physical security against sanctions. And you can't see this pivot more clearly than in Asia, where physical wealth is now being prioritized over consumer wealth. Let's look at the contrast in China. On one hand, you have this huge national wealth story. China announced the discovery of Asia's largest offshore gold deposit near Shandong province. This boosts the region's reserves to over 3,900 tons. It's a massive step in their long-term gold strategy. But then you contrast that with the consumer picture. The economic cooling has hit hard. Luxury giants like LVMH, even huge domestic jewelers like Chow Tai Fook, they're all issuing weaker forecasts because Chinese demand has just fallen off a cliff.
And that contrast captures the entire story of the Chinese economy right now. You've got this severe divergence between national wealth and people's wealth. The state is aggressively building a strategic bulwark. This gold discovery, it's not just a resource story, it's a strategic shield. It's a lesson learned from watching the sanctions hit Russia. Beijing is de-risking from the dollar. Meanwhile, the population is feeling intense anxiety. They're not buying high-end jewelry anymore. That's the luxury shame trend we're seeing. Instead, they're using what capital they have to buy small, physical gold bars for asset preservation. It's a fundamental signal of distress.
Right, survival over status.
Exactly. They're prioritizing surviving the future over showing off in the present.
And that deep anxiety about the future, it's also reshaping the entire security architecture in East Asia. A major post-war taboo is now being seriously challenged, especially in Japan. The facts here are, frankly, explosive. Under the Takaichi administration, a senior government official publicly suggested Japan should possess nuclear weapons. This breaks decades of post-war consensus, and the reaction from North Korea was immediate and harsh. They said Japan's nuclear armament must be stopped at any cost.
It's just, you cannot overstate the gravity of that. Japan, the only country to have experienced nuclear warfare, is now even discussing this. It's an earthquake in regional security.
And this security shift is directly tied to domestic policy. The ruling coalition agreed to a tax reform that boosts the income tax threshold, a win for consumers, but in exchange for approving defense tax hikes. These hikes are needed to push defense spending to 2.0% of GDP in 2025. That's 2 years ahead of schedule.
Exactly. It's a clear quid pro quo, the domestic benefit for aggressive security funding. And as for the nuclear talk, it's almost certainly what we'd call an intentional observational balloon.
An observational balloon. So the statement is the weapon.
Precisely. It's likely not an immediate plan for possession. It's a high-stakes negotiating card. The main purpose is leverage, to force the U.S. to give a stronger, more explicit commitment on extended deterrence, that's the U.S. nuclear umbrella. Or it's leverage to get faster access to high-end U.S. weapons, like Tomahawks. They're signaling that if Washington won't speed up delivery, well, Tokyo might start thinking about self-reliance. But intent aside, the risk is massive. This just accelerates the regional arms race. It moves deterrence from a single, stable pillar, the U.S.-Japan alliance, into this far more complex, dangerous, multipolar nuclear game. It drastically increases the risk of miscalculation, of an accidental collision.
That speed, that diplomatic and military escalation, it's being mirrored perfectly in the digital domain. AI is fundamentally changing the velocity and scale of attacks on critical infrastructure.
Yeah, let's look at the cyber data. Anthropic confirmed their coding AI, Claude Code, was actively misused by state-sponsored hacker groups linked to China and North Korea for espionage and ransomware campaigns. But what's really terrifying is the speed. The data shows the AI agent performed, 80 to 90% of the tactical tasks in the attack? Reconnaissance, scanning, exploit creation, all at a speed that's just impossible for a human operator. The human just sets the goal. Right. The AI dual-use threat is no longer theoretical. It's operational. A productivity tool has become one of the most dangerous automated weapons we've ever seen. The speed of that attack loop, human defenders just cannot keep up.
And the targets underscore the danger to everyday life. We're looking at 50% of 2025 ransomware attacks hitting essential services, manufacturing, healthcare, energy systems. These are attacks designed to cause physical damage.
That's the strategic reality. You're now looking at a drastically increased risk of physical damage from cyber attacks, power outages, hospital systems failing. And this is forcing a massive response. We are now in an AI versus AI conflict. Your defenses have to be automated to even stand a chance. And the long-term implication here is a fundamental loss of trust in the internet for critical functions. national defense, essential infrastructure, they're all being forced to reevaluate. We're actually seeing a strategic reversal, a return to physically air-gapped systems and reliable analog backups.
So we've looked at the liquefaction of global order across kinetic, financial, and digital theaters. The common thread is this retreat from international norms, forcing states to rely on force, fear, and unilateral hedges to secure their own futures.
To summarize for decision makers, you're really looking at three converging pillars of instability. First, the kinetic risk, the rising chance of an accidental collision in East Asia as these post-war taboos collapse. Second, economic fragmentation. The global economy is breaking into fortress-like blocks. You see it with the U.S. blockades and with China's strategic gold accumulation. And third, hybridization. The battle space is now this seamless blend of, old school military action like the Sumy abductions and these hyper-fast automated cyber operations against civilian infrastructure. The threats are converging at a speed we've never seen.
So if the rule of law is failing and financial systems are being weaponized, how long until the global south, facing crises like those in Nigeria and South Africa, just completely abandons the Western-led framework? How long until they switch to these new resource-backed, non-aligned economic blocks where security, not stability, is the main feature? That's the question we're left with. Neural Pulse. Clarity in a complex world. See you tomorrow.